Drama of Truth with your host, Father Vincent Michelli of the Society of Jesus, and Dr. William Mara, Professor of Philosophy at Fordham University. Today's program, Comte, Atheism for Scientists.
Welcome to Drama of Truth. This is the 7th program in a series of 8. And today we will be treating of Atheism for Scientists, Auguste Comte's theory of atheistic humanism. Now, Auguste Comte wrote his famous 5-volume course of positive philosophy. And this course of positive philosophy was to show man how he could take care of all the projects of his life, answer all the problems of his life, without any adherence to God whatsoever. Auguste Comte said that he was seeking for man who was completely devoid of God. He would replace Christianity in Europe with men who no longer believed in God. This was his particular intellectual project.
You called him an atheist, and I think we'd have to agree, but would you put him in the category of militant atheist like some of the people we've been discussing?
Well, personally, Auguste Comte was a militant atheist. He said, for example, as a child, atheism was in his blood. He never believed in God because he's the child of the French Revolution, and he existed in the regime when it was forbidden by national law to even baptize children. But in his atheism, which he projects in his work, he's not a voluntaristic atheist like Nietzsche was, or even Marx, but he's more cerebral. He develops a science of atheism, which he says comes out of man's ability to think, reflect on his experiences, and therefore his atheism is a scientific atheism.
In other words, he didn't say we don't want God. Nietzsche said that we don't want God, God's a nuisance. He said it is true that thanks to our scientific knowledge, we know there is no God.
That's right. He was out to prove from studying man's growth in his scientific knowledge that really God is not necessary for man at all, for him to fulfill his project. That really there's no trace of God in man. Moreover, he decided that he would go through all of man's learning, his development and learning, and through this study, which was a massive work in his 5 volumes, he would show that God was really unnecessary for man, that science was the apex of man's development and his full maturity.
So he was an atheist, and in his own way a militant atheist, and would you say he was against religion?
Well, he was against certainly the Christian religion, which he constantly made fun of. Therefore, he considered that Christian religion kept man in a sort of a state of infancy, superstition, prevented him from developing his powers. But nonetheless, he did think that there was a religion of science that he could develop out of his study of man's social life. So that really, he wasn't, in the beginning, he wanted to replace the religion of Christianity with the religion of science.
And how did he prove scientifically that traditional religion is false?
Well, in a way, Auguste Comte had a very plausible theory. He talked about the 3 stages of man's development in history. The first stage he called the fictitious, or the theological. And in that stage, man is in his infancy. He has great fears. He cannot explain the universe. He sees storms, earthquakes, and he concludes that there must be a God whom he's displeasing or must please in order to get along in life and be protected and have his crops come up and his family grow. So every time man in this stage would turn over a rock, he thought he saw angels or devils. He spoke about this phase growing from fetishism to polytheism and finally to theism. This religious stage or fictitious stage had even its own growth within itself, so that certain parts of animals were used to please the gods, certain stones, certain fetishes were used, and then that moved into the polytheism of the pagans, and then into theism. Well, man finally, as he grew into his adolescence, slowly began to organize his thoughts, and this is what he calls his metaphysical or abstract phase. He discards slowly more and more the myths of religion, the angels, the devils, the gods, the many gods, and he concentrates toward a one God, theism. But even here, Comte says that as man is organizing his thoughts and his concepts, he cannot get completely away from religion because he has the idea of God. He philosophizes about God's existence, and therefore even in his metaphysical or abstract stage, there is the perfume of the theological stage still in man's mentality and consciousness as he's going through his development. But finally, he escapes from the metaphysical stage into the scientific or positive stage. And here it is that he sees that all religion is useless. That is, all religion known up to this time is useless. It's a handicap to his development of conquering the universe, building a humane society, developing politics, developing the social disciplines of man's life. And so when he comes of age, and by the way, that phrase, man comes of age, goes all the way back to Auguste Comte. So it's not a modern phrase. When he comes of age in science, he's liberated from the two former stages. Now, they were necessary for man's development, but like St. Paul said, when I was a child, I did things of a child. When I became a man, I put off the things of a child. So Comte says, now that we're in the scientific stage, we put off the things of the religious stage and the philosophical stage, and we have reached the age of maturity. Science should rule our lives.
You know, I have two comments to make on that. The first is that these three stages of history in which we have this ascent or progress, we go from fetishism or religion to philosophy and then to positive science. Unfortunately, that is being taught right now in a former Catholic university. I might add, in many former Catholic universities. We have courses in social science, and the title of the course is Myth, Magic, Religion, and Science. And of course, myth and magic and religion are the infancy of man, and finally we have progressed to this stage where the great thing is science. The second observation is that when Comte talks about science, he himself was not a physicist, a chemist, or anything else. That he claimed to be a social scientist, and I think we ought to be alert to this, that I myself have a great awe of real science, natural science, that when I face a physicist, a chemist, or a biologist, and when these people are dealing really with their field, I say, boy, you guys know something. You have an explicit way of discovering something about matter and energy. So most of us, I think, are intimidated, rightly so. We're in awe of the natural scientists, but along comes Comte, and he deals with the human person, with society. He claims the name of science for his study, and I think it's a far cry, though, from the real science of the natural science.
Yes, he calls it social physics or sociology. Comte is the first one to coin the word sociology. And as you know, sociology today is a very popular science. Comte is very much with us. He's a modern man in the sense that he's riveted man's attention on the study of man, which means exclusively the study of man. That's where all knowledge is found, and this is a form of humanism. He will turn that into a scientific religious humanism, and he will move that scientific religious humanism towards a religion of, or politics of utopia here on this earth, with, of course, the great pope of this utopia being Auguste Comte himself. So he's very much with us, as you know.
And you know, it's not just that he studies men. I don't even have any objection to a person saying, I want to study men, but he studies men from one point of view. He wants this kind of pseudo-scientific thing of control groups and looking at things from the outside. He studies men and societies as if we were anthills, as if we were some sort of impersonal being without freedom, without a consciousness of God, without revelation. That is precisely the danger of sociology, and it is a growth industry. If you look at a college catalog, they might have 3 or 4 courses in theology and philosophy. There are 55 courses in social science, and that's the transmission belt, I'm afraid, of most of the atheism drugging the college students of today. It's in the social sciences.
So you see what Comte does by rejecting transcendental knowledge, the knowledge of philosophy and theology. He has a myopic view. He's nearsighted. All he sees for truth is what he can get through the experimental sciences, through his senses and whatnot. Therefore, he cuts off the infinite projection into the transcendent in philosophy and theology, so that man is cut back and left in the straitjacket for all his intellectual activity, the straitjacket of time and space. and his scientific instruments. He puts blinders on man's intellectual vision and really clamps it back into himself and into time and into matter. Whereas we all know that the transcendent project of true knowledge is into what we call into the eternal truths, the truths that deal with being, with meaning, with beauty, with immortality, with justice, with love, the spiritual, and then projecting even further into the knowledge that we get from revelation. So that is what we need to do, what we need to correct in Comte. He definitely imprisons man in time.
You know, he, of course, was riding the heyday of the French Revolution. He was 30 years or so past the French Revolution, and he wrote once to his friend, a rather arrogant point, if you ask me. He said, "I am convinced I shall be preaching positivism," his religion of social science. "I am convinced I shall be preaching positivism at Notre Dame Cathedral." He means, of course, the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Now, I don't think he quite made it to Notre Dame. That wonderful Gothic cathedral dedicated to the Holy Virgin has seen some strange things in its time, of course, that right after the French Revolution we had this abomination where they took a naked prostitute and crowned her the goddess of reason in Notre Dame Cathedral. But I don't think Comte was able to make it. He didn't make good on his promise that he personally would be preaching positivism at the cathedral. But would you say that maybe some of his successors have had better luck?
Oh, definitely. Comte's influence in today's Catholic Church is very great. For example, I am convinced that without even realizing they are the children of Auguste Comte, many priests who are preaching the social doctrine of social salvation in the Church, concentrating on making this place a better world to live in and forgetting the transcendent aspects of the Catholic faith, namely the metanoia of the mind, the giving up of sin, the following of Christ at the cross. These are preaching, rather, the utopian ideas of the Church, namely we must get rid of underdeveloped areas, we must get rid of exploitation, there's only social sin, and if we do that, then the kingdom of God will be added to us. This is wrong. Christ said it's the other way around. Seek first the kingdom of God. Preach the gospel I gave you. Salvation of souls, the greater glory of God, the sanctification of men, and then all the rest will be added unto you. A preacher in today's church is definitely a disciple of Auguste Comte, because the whole gospel by them is now reduced to bettering this world's quality of life, the environment of this world's life. They are utopians already. And the one thing you notice about Auguste Comte's sociology and sociocracy, because he intends to have a state which is also in control of religion, the natural religion of humanism. The one thing you notice about it, it is a clear utopia. Hasn't got its feet on the ground at all. It comes right out of the cool and cerebral working of Auguste Comte's brain.
And I think he's gone further than that. Never mind that the content that he was so in love with, the religion of humanity, has unfortunately progressed so far today, but the method, this idea that the social sciences are the way to learn something about God or morality or whatever, I'm afraid that has tremendously succeeded today. We live in an age where in the name of sociology, in the name, in other words, of ringing doorbells and asking people what they think about homosexuality, what they think about contraception, in the name of sociology, we are now prepared, Catholic priests included, professors of ethics, we are now prepared to change our ethics because of the Kinsey report.
Of course, you see what Auguste Comte does, as you know, he reduces religion to being politics. And politics is raised to be an exact science, and he calls that sociology. Therefore, what happens? All the laws that he establishes in sociology are to be inflicted on the masses. They have no freedom at all, no part in handling public affairs. Propaganda, sentiment of the people will all be controlled by what Comte calls, in his particular society, of the priesthood of the scientists. The scientists hand down the doctrines that Auguste Comte has thought up and written about for the faithful, and the scientists are the priests. And if the faithful do not pay attention to the scientists, then of course there are all sorts of sanctions against them, so that it becomes a religious imperialism, even though it's a sociologically religious imperialism, a naturalistic, humanistic imperialism. So Comte really got into politics, which he considered also part of his sociocracy or his sociology.
And you say that in the first place he rejected God because of alleged scientific research, that there's something honorable at least about that, that a man would say, there's a kind of sadness to it. A man would say, gee, I'd like to believe in God, but the more I read history, the more I read physics, the more I know chemistry, the more I realize that God is just an invention of the infancy of man. There's a kind of honor to that. But you say also that he had a political reason for rejecting God.
Comte said that God actually was the rival of man, and he stood in the way of man's development of his politics, the art of governing himself. As a matter of fact, that's an old idea. It comes right out of Feuerbach, who said that man projects his best qualities to an imaginary God outside himself, and then he settles down to a miserable life here, hoping to live with this imaginary God in the next world, but then he neglects his project in this world. Comte blames Christianity for the degradation of man, turning his eyes away from his project in life and towards a future world, and God is his big rival. God prevents him. If he can get rid of God, the albatross of God, if he can throw that off his neck, then he'll be free to create his own politics, create his own sociology, create a humane existence of great progress.
You know, there's always this moral dimension, therefore, to atheism. No matter how people protest that it's purely scientific or purely atheistic, it seems that the root of it all is this: mankind, the atheist, cannot endure an infinite God. They act as if the infinity of God reduces us to nothingness, whereas the truth is just the opposite. It's only when I understand my own vocation as a creature of God that I live in the truth. And then I'm really big. Then I'm really important. But we have this unfortunate rivalry, this unfortunate competition, as if God is the enemy.
That's
and
right.
not sin.
Now you notice that the type of God that Comte creates is not the God that Feuerbach had, abstract humanity, nor the God that Nietzsche had, Superman, the elitist, nor the God that Marx had, the classless society, the masses. No, Comte has social humanity. This is God. That is the concrete-sized social humanity. And in that, the group of members of social humanity that represent the divinity of man, anyone who hurts man, who's been a criminal, is cast out. Even great men like Robespierre and Napoleon and people like that who created major wars or killed many people, they're ruled out as heroes or saints in that religion. Only those who have worked for the betterment of mankind, they are saints in the religion of humanity. And the God is social humanity, and all those who work altruistically for the betterment of social humanity, they are the saints. They are in the calendar of saints in the church of Auguste Comte.
And he, in a sense, he wasn't content, in other words, merely to ridicule sarcastically Christianity, but he must have had enough admiration of Christianity to try and copy some of the forms of Christianity. He had a priesthood, in other words.
Absolutely. You'll always notice that most of these atheists who are substituting false gods for the true God, therefore aping God himself, then creating false religions for the true religion, they have to incarnate that religion in a false church. So Comte had his church. The temple was the Pantheon in Paris.
Is this actually a church in Paris?
Yes. The Pantheon is in Paris.
Yes.
Definitely the great men of all times are enshrined there, their statues and whatnot. So Comte picked that for his church. He would put his great men in there. So Comte then went on. He had feast days. He had times of prayer. He had, for example, the priesthood teaching the people the doctrines they were to take. Naturally, Comte was the pope of this church, and all the scientists that he chose were, as a matter of fact, those who got their doctrine from him and their orders from him and then preached to the faithful. And if the faithful did not follow, they were ostracized, so that members of the church of Comte who had businesses would not do business or sell necessary objects and needs to heretics in the Comtean church.
And what were the Holy Scriptures, by the way?
The Holy Scriptures were Comte had a set of 100 books, which he chose. And, of course, his own philosophies, 5 books on the course of positive philosophy. These were chosen carefully by him. And, as a matter of fact, he ordered his people not to read anything else and to stay away from newspapers and whatnot, to stay with the pure doctrine. So he really was a great censor of the reading of his faithful.
You know, I heard that Comte had several interesting personal facts about his biography. One involved a woman, and one involved the Jesuits. So let's talk a bit about the woman in his life.
That's very interesting, showing you how a man who tries to make himself Pope and God suddenly falls because of the great pride he had. Well, what happened was, as he was finishing the 5th book of the course in positive philosophy, his wife had been a very great help to him, but their relationship had gotten sour. And she stayed with him until the final book was finished, and then they separated and broke. And so Auguste Comte was lonely, and he went to some party and met this beautiful lady, young lady, Clotilde Vaux, and fell head over heels in love with her. Well, Clotilde didn't respond to his advances, and he was heartbroken, but then she suddenly died of some disease, and he was heartbroken, and he fell into this grand passion for Clotilde that he had, continued now to control and obsess him. And he prayed to her 3 times a day, put flowers in the chair where she died. She became the virgin, not the virgin, but the feminine ideal of his church. And then he had a trinity of the great being, the great environment, and the great space. So you see, this church was an ape of the Catholic Church with a trinity, a feminine ideal, saints that Comte picked on, and the Pope was Auguste Comte himself, showing you how when man falls for making himself God, he falls into the creation of ridiculous religion.
And what a
Catholic Church.
What a bitter irony, too, that France is the eldest daughter of the Church. The magnificent cathedrals were reared to the Blessed Virgin, the Mother of God.
Yes.
And this new religion of science starts praying to a mere, probably a courtesan, but certainly not a very holy woman.
He actually became ridiculous, and near the end of his life, he was considered to be out of his mind. Actually, the point on the Jesuits, he was still very well within his faculties when he was creating his scientific sociocracy. It was then that he said, I need learned men to run my sociocracy. Now, he looked around and saw that the Jesuits were the most learned men of the time. Intelligent, urbane, classical, liberal education, scientific education. So he went to see the general of the time and invited him to let the Jesuits leave the Catholic Church and become the priesthood of scientists in the Comtean religion, sociocracy. The general had enough humor and wit to say, Monsieur Comte, thank you for the offer now. There is the door. And Monsieur Comte left without having gathered in any of the brilliant Jesuits that he would have loved to have been members of the priesthood of the scientists in his church.
You know, I could see it was a temptation. The Jesuits had such a glorious history of real religious fervor, great education, great intelligence, and it was a mark of of Comte's intelligence in the sense to try to get this religious order on his side, but they were true to their foundation. I wonder whether today they could resist such an attractive offer as that of Comte.
Well, today the danger would be to dialogue with Comte, and when you dialogue for a long time, you tend to lose members. Something happens in the thinking and their orientation gets mislaid, and thank God that the general didn't dialogue with Auguste Comte, because I'm sure Comte was a very brilliant man at dialogue, you see. Well, now we're down to our last 3 minutes, and I'd like to tell our audience that it's important to know that science has its place in man's life. It handles the experimental knowledges, the knowledge that he can get through his senses, the marvelous instruments he creates. However, it only is part of the great knowledge that God has given us, wisdom God has given us. If the scientist rejects going beyond his own science into the metaphysical, transcendent truth, and into the theological, then he locks himself, unfortunately, in a very narrow corner. Whereas the Church always loves the doctrine of science, and she completes it with the doctrine of true philosophy and the truths garnered from God's revelation. So, as we continue and finish this seventh program of our 8th series, we would ask you, if you're interested in the show, please let your friends know. Let us hear from you. We will definitely respond to you in the letter. Nobody will be ignored. Your very interest, whatever your generosity is, your very suggestions will be adhered to. We need more Catholics, more Christians who are awake. Remember what Christ said? You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. If we don't reflect in our lives the truth of Christ, the high moral standards of Christ, then we're going to be dead Christians and trampled on by the world outside. Whatever way you can help the show, even financially. Remember, Christ praised the widow who put her little mite into the basket at the temple, and he said, She gave more than anyone else because she gave all she had. We need finances. These will be tax-deductible finances to help us continue the show. We plan a series on what's wrong with the new morality for the fall, next fall. We have one more program for this series, the next one, which will be called The Answer to Atheism. So let us hear from you, and don't hesitate to stand up and be counted for the cause of Christ. This program is meant strictly for our listening audience, to enlighten them, to bring them closer to the ideals of Christ, to bring them closer to a life of faith, to bring them closer to a life of holiness. We need one another. Truth is social, and what better means to use than the television screen to which many people go just to be instructed or even just to be entertained. There's no reason why growing in truth should not be pleasurable, should not be profoundly joyous, should not be uplifting, should not cast our vision beyond the mere everyday banal events of life into the very profound mysteries of knowing truth, growing in truth, knowing God, growing in love of God, and being in communion with God so that we can grow in holiness. That's the whole purpose of this show. No other purpose did we have in mind. As I said earlier, and as Dr. Maris said in the first show, we are in an age of darkness. It's up to you to put the light on in the world.